She thought she could get away with murder in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My diabetic son was just a pawn in her petty HOA power trip. But she made one fatal mistake. She messed with the wrong family. I'm not just any father. I'm the CIA director. And now, I'm bringing down hell. Willow Creek presented itself as a quiet suburban paradise, complete with pristine sidewalks, freshly trimmed hedges, and a homeowners association that prided itself on order. The residents followed the rules with almost religious devotion. Driveways were power-washed weekly, trash bins hidden precisely within the confines of HOA guidelines, and even holiday decorations were timed to perfection. Behind the illusion of calm lay a different reality. One governed not by fairness, but by fear of a single woman's authority. Karen Langford, the self-appointed queen of compliance, ruled the neighborhood like a petty dictator draped in pearls and passive aggression. Her control extended beyond what was written in the community bylaws. Unspoken rules emerged wherever she walked, often enforced with anonymous complaints, surprise inspections, or cold, calculated, friendly reminders. Residents whispered her name at backyard barbecues and late-night get-togethers, sharing stories of lawn violations and fines for garden gnomes deemed visually disruptive. Most learned quickly to avoid confrontation. Others packed up and moved, unable to bear the constant policing. But Karen remained, never elected, never challenged, always watching. Among the targets of her scrutiny were any signs of vulnerability or deviation from her standards. Disabled residents, interracial families, single parents, and those with medical conditions often found themselves under tighter surveillance. To Karen, anything that disrupted her sense of uniform perfection was a threat. The moment a medical cooler appeared outside a particular townhouse, clearly labeled with emergency insulin instructions, her attention sharpened. Rather than ask questions, she assumed violations. Rather than show empathy, she took offense. A written complaint arrived within 24 hours. The language was clinical and detached. Improper storage of biohazardous materials. Potential contamination risk. Possible violation of HOA Hygiene Code subsection 4A. No one in the association had ever heard of subsection 4A. But the fine came anyway, $200, and a warning of escalating penalties for non-compliance. When the family called to clarify that the cooler was medically necessary, the response was cold. Karen claimed she was simply following policy and ensuring the safety of all residents. Soon after, more citations followed. Grass and inch too high, alleged noise violations despite silence, reports of suspicious activity around the mailbox. Each warning seemed to come from nowhere, yet always arrived with Karen's signature. The residents around them began to withdraw, afraid of guilt by association. The family found themselves isolated, boxed in by invisible lines drawn by a woman who craved submission. Karen's disdain for the family was never explicitly stated, but the signs were clear. She referred to the boy as that special needs case in hushed tones during board meetings. She complained about people bringing their problems into this neighborhood. To those who questioned her behavior, she played the victim, citing her long-standing service and dedication to the HOA. She painted the family as ungrateful newcomers who didn't respect the community's values. Her manipulation of perception was so deft that some began to believe her. Beneath all of it was a seething contempt, one fueled by her need to maintain absolute control. She believed the rules were an extension of her will, and anyone who resisted was a problem to be corrected or removed. Medical conditions didn't matter. Compassion didn't factor in. Order was her gospel, and she saw the diabetic child as a disruption to the perfect symmetry she enforced with military precision. The pressure escalated, but the family refused to give in. They documented every citation, filed counterclaims, and began quietly compiling evidence. Still, they never suspected things would go beyond harassment. It was neighborhood politics, mean-spirited, but not dangerous. That illusion shattered the day the child collapsed on the living room floor. The insulin cooler, previously left outside in accordance with emergency access protocol, had been moved. Inside, the insulin vials showed no immediate signs of tampering. But the dosage administered triggered a violent reaction, one consistent with chemical contamination. Emergency responders acted fast. The hospital worked even faster. What they found was shocking. The insulin had been altered, contaminated with a compound that mimicked the medication's appearance but suppressed its function entirely. A child's life nearly ended over a HOA dispute. Speculation turned into certainty. When preliminary analysis showed the contamination wasn't accidental, someone had handled the vials deliberately. The implications were terrifying. This wasn't just harassment or bullying. This was attempted murder. All suspicions, all patterns of abuse, all anonymous reports now pointed toward the same conclusion. Karen Langford had gone too far, beyond fines, beyond petty control, into criminal territory. The incident sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. Some neighbors pretended not to know what was happening. Others whispered their guilt at not stepping in sooner. Yet none of them fully grasped what Karen had triggered. They didn't know the boy's father wasn't just another homeowner. They didn't know that beneath his quiet, composed exterior lay the full force and reach of the Central Intelligence Agency. Karen had picked the wrong family. The suburban tyrant's reign of terror was about to end, not with a neighborhood vote, but with federal consequences. The diagnosis came swiftly: severe hypoglycemia, rapid onset, insulin shock. The child had entered a dangerously low blood sugar state within minutes of the injection. Doctors, trained to respond to emergencies but not sabotage, first questioned dosage and expiration dates. When none of the usual causes explained the collapse, they tested the vial. The results changed everything. The insulin had been tainted with a diluted synthetic analog that suppressed its function without visibly altering the liquid. A deliberate act. Someone had weaponized a child's medication. Medical protocol dictated that such findings be reported immediately to law enforcement. Toxicology confirmed that the foreign agent used in the insulin was not only harmful, it was rare, difficult to obtain, and required some knowledge of chemical compounds. This wasn't the work of an amateur or a careless mistake. It was calculated. It was intentional. The only people who could have accessed the vial were those in close proximity to the property. Given the placement of the cooler outside and the neighborhood's limited foot traffic, the list of suspects narrowed rapidly. The family, already reeling from the near death of their child, now faced the unthinkable. Someone had tried to kill him. Not through brute force, but through sabotage, exploiting his dependency on life-saving medication. The quiet suburb of Willow Creek transformed overnight from a place of routine into a crime scene under scrutiny. The once ignored tensions between the family and the HOA president now appeared in a more sinister light. The fines, the complaints, the escalating harassment, all of it retroactively revealed a pattern of targeting. Karen Langford had established a sustained campaign of pressure, weaponizing HOA policies as tools of coercion. She treated the family's presence as an offense against the order she curated. But until now, those actions were seen as petty and cruel, not potentially homicidal. The timeline of her hostility now overlapped with the timeline of the insulin sabotage. Motivation, opportunity, and behavior converged in a disturbing symmetry. Karen had, over months, built a justification in her own mind for removing the family from the neighborhood. Her language in HOA meetings grew sharper, framing the child's medical needs as a nuisance or a hazard. She lobbied for new policies about public health standards that specifically targeted items like medical containers. She cited fictional bylaws to impose penalties. She spread rumors to create an illusion of community concern. It became clear that she wasn't just enforcing rules. She was building a paper trail to dehumanize her targets. The cooler, once left just outside the front door to ensure emergency access for school staff, paramedics, or caregivers, became the focal point of Karen's vendetta. She claimed it was unsightly, unhygienic, and a threat to neighborhood safety. Her fixation grew. Security camera footage showed her walking past the house on multiple occasions, often pausing near the cooler. Neighbors recalled seeing her loitering nearby at odd hours, always alone, always watching. Each incident, at the time dismissed as nosy behavior, now carried darker implications. Analysis of the container revealed faint smudge marks inconsistent with the family's fingerprints. Karen's were not on file, but a subpoena for her HOA-issued correspondence logs turned up evidence of intent. In one email to a fellow board member, she wrote cryptically about removing the problem at its root, and how some people just need to be pushed out. The vagueness of her language previously allowed her to deny responsibility. But combined with the forensic data, her coded language now read like a veiled threat. For the family, shock turned into determination. The idea that someone in a position of neighborhood authority would tamper with a child's medication ignited a new resolve. Legal channels were activated. The incident moved from hospital protocol to criminal investigation. Experts in chemical analysis, forensic psychology, and behavioral profiling were called in. The sabotage wasn't just an isolated act. It followed a progression. What began as bureaucratic hostility had escalated into psychological warfare and then into chemical aggression. Karen had underestimated her target. She believed the family was just another group of residents too overwhelmed to fight back. She believed the HOA shielded her. What she didn't know was that the child's father had years of experience in high-threat environments, had led counterintelligence teams through hostile territory, and had access to resources that bypassed red tape. This wasn't his first time dealing with a hidden threat, but this was the first time the target was his child. The quiet gathering of evidence, the silent tracking of patterns, the extraction of metadata from HOA files, all done with precision. Nothing leaked. Nothing warned her. The investigation expanded beyond neighborhood boundaries. The chemical used in the insulin sabotage was traced to a vendor that had logged an order under a false name, one that matched a burner email connected to an IP address within Willow Creek. The operation tightened. Surveillance feeds were reviewed. Network logs scanned. Karen's digital fingerprint began to emerge. Her mask of suburban civility could no longer hide the trail of reckless hatred. She had crossed a line from annoying bureaucrat to calculated offender. The story was no longer about HOA fines or petty complaints. It was now about a child who could have died from a substance meant to heal him. The attempt was not only personal, it was criminal, federal, and undeniable. The security perimeter around Willow Creek was designed for comfort, not for conflict. Fences marked boundaries. Porch lights lit up sidewalks. Cameras, when installed, focused on package thieves or wayward raccoons, not internal threats. But with a child nearly killed through medical sabotage and a trail of digital evidence linking the act to someone within the neighborhood, the system had to be re-engineered. The game shifted from domestic tranquility to domestic intelligence. The tools that once protected nations were now deployed in a gated community under the guise of normalcy. Wireless signals from local routers were mapped, analyzed for traffic patterns, and cross-referenced with metadata from anonymous messages. Device signatures, phones, laptops, tablets, were cataloged through passive scans. Karen Langford's home emitted a steady stream of encrypted traffic during late-night hours, an anomaly among the residents. An untraceable email used to order the synthetic compound matched her IP range, though the signal had been masked through basic proxy tools. Amateur-level obfuscation, easily penetrable with agency-grade systems. Forensics teams reconstructed timelines. Every known instance of Karen's public hostility matched windows of suspicious network activity. Security footage revealed her routine. Morning walks, midday HOA inspections, unannounced visits to properties under review. Her car, always parked 3 inches from curbs, bore no signs of tampering, but her digital behavior told another story. Data logs indicated login attempts to HOA databases at odd hours. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was curating narratives, deleting favorable reports, and rewriting complaint histories to cover her tracks. Neighbor testimonies previously vague or fearful began to solidify once shown evidence under the right pressure. Karen had asked unusual questions, inquired about insulin storage, expressed disdain for medical clutter in shared spaces. One resident admitted to being pressured into filing a noise complaint by Karen, who threatened to fine him for unrelated violations if he refused. Another revealed that Karen had once asked for spare keys to monitor properties of absent homeowners, an action deeply outside the bounds of her role. Her web of influence, maintained through fear and manipulation, started to unravel. Behavioral analysts reviewed her speech patterns, tone, and written correspondence. Her language shifted over time from policy enforcement to personal vendetta. Early memos referenced community harmony and compliance. Later ones used terms like containment, removal, and restoration. Words carried weight, especially when paired with her increasing obsession over one family. The cooler, the insulin, the child. Each became symbolic targets, in her war against what she saw as disruption. Digital intercepts showed a draft email saved but never sent, written in a moment of emotional outburst. The message accused the family of endangering the neighborhood with their problems and declared her intent to clean things up before someone really gets hurt. The timestamp placed it 2 days before the insulin contamination. Its presence in her system, undeleted, reinforced intent and premeditation. Her efforts to cover her tracks were careful, but not complete. Financial records revealed additional layers. Karen had recently purchased a series of untraceable gift cards and made cash withdrawals inconsistent with her usual spending habits. A small chemical supply order appeared under an alias, billed to a P.O. box outside of town. Surveillance footage from the collection center matched her vehicle. The dots connected. The path grew clear. She had planned the contamination carefully, buying time with anonymity and relying on her reputation for plausible deniability. While the forensic and digital teams closed in, a psychological profile formed in parallel. Karen's behavior matched traits associated with control-obsessed narcissism, aggravated by perceived slights and triggered by any challenge to authority. The family, simply by existing outside her control, represented that challenge. Their refusal to comply with her arbitrary rules pushed her further into extremism. The presence of a diabetic child, visible, vulnerable, and symbolically resistant, became the focus of her escalating aggression. What she didn't know, and could never have predicted, was the background of the father. Years spent in intelligence work had honed instincts others ignored. Micro-expressions, unexplained inconsistencies, abnormal behavioral shifts, all registered and logged. The moment his child fell, the mask of civilian life dropped. He didn't panic, he mobilized. Surveillance equipment appeared, unobtrusive but efficient. Entry points were monitored. Movement logs created. The entire neighborhood, unaware, became part of a quiet investigation led by someone trained to extract truths in war zones and corridors of deception. Karen had operated under the illusion of superiority. She believed her influence within the HOA insulated her from scrutiny. She assumed the legal system would stall any meaningful investigation. She counted on fear, silence, and her reputation. But her enemy wasn't an ordinary parent. He was trained in asset extraction, psychological warfare, and counter-subversion. He knew how to wait, how to isolate variables, how to follow patterns invisible to the untrained eye. By the time Karen realized something was wrong, her house had already been flagged, her emails decrypted, her browser logs reconstructed, her fingerprints matched to compromised vials, her alibis discredited. The agency didn't just collect information, they built cases. And the case against Karen Langford wasn't just compelling, it was airtight. The evidence, once fragmented, now formed a complete picture. A campaign of intimidation had escalated into an act of chemical sabotage. A child was nearly killed, and the woman behind it had unknowingly declared war on someone who wrote countermeasures for a living. There would be no warning. There would be no negotiation. Only justice, methodical and unstoppable. Karen Langford's facade of control began to fracture under the weight of accumulating evidence. Her daily rituals, once performed with robotic precision, now showed signs of disruption. Her morning patrols shortened. Her HOA emails grew erratic. Her tone in neighborhood communications shifted from condescending assurance to vague defensiveness. Residents noticed the change but could not explain it. The once untouchable enforcer of rules now avoided eye contact, skipped scheduled inspections, and rarely lingered outside longer than necessary. The federal investigation had already passed the threshold of plausible deniability. Forensic results confirmed a match between Karen's fingerprints and the tampered insulin cooler. Surveillance analysis placed her within proximity of the crime window. Her burner email account, used to purchase the synthetic agent, was linked through a masked VPN entry routed through her own modem. Keylogger data retrieved from her devices provided typing cadence unique to her, further confirming authorship of incriminating messages. Her digital footprint was as distinct as a fingerprint, and it now lived in federal records. Behavioral analysis fed into the timeline reconstruction. The saboteur's actions followed a psychological escalation curve: harassment, social isolation, indirect threats, and finally physical interference. The deliberate contamination of life-saving medication fit the final stage. The victim's identity, a diabetic child, represented both vulnerability and symbolism in Karen's warped perception. She viewed the family not just as neighbors, out of order, but as a disruption to her control-driven worldview. In her mind, restoring order required elimination of the threat, no matter the cost. The confrontation was planned with clinical precision. Federal law enforcement, operating in tandem with internal agency contacts, prepared a full-sweep warrant. Legal procedures were followed. Evidence was cataloged and presented before the proper channels. The arrest strategy incorporated behavioral contingencies, anticipating potential resistance, mental instability, or flight. A psychological assessment placed Karen at high risk for emotional collapse under direct confrontation. Hence, timing and environment were optimized to reduce risk and maximize compliance. At exactly 3 a.m., the operation commenced. The perimeter around Karen's property was secured. Motion-activated floodlights were disabled. Cellular signals were intercepted to prevent outgoing alerts. A silent approach ensured that neighbors would remain unaware until formal announcements were made. Karen was presented with a physical dossier, pages of evidence, photos, timestamps, and forensic analysis, each page a mirror to her hidden actions. She was not given time to argue or deflect. Every question had already been answered in her own data trail. Her reaction matched predictive profiles: denial, followed by deflection, then silence. No confession, no remorse. Her voice, once sharp and commanding in community meetings, became flat and uncertain. Her eyes, trained to spot weeds and sidewalk cracks, now scanned the faces of those who saw her for what she had become. The woman who fined children for sidewalk chalk had nearly killed one with a vial of poison. Her authority dissolved in the face of truth, documented and irreversible. Within hours, she was taken into custody. Charges included attempted murder, unlawful tampering with medical supplies, domestic terrorism under federal statute, and multiple counts of harassment under civil and criminal codes. Her house was searched in accordance with the warrant. Hidden compartments yielded a secondary burner phone, handwritten notes detailing family routines, HOA files altered to hide key interactions, and a small vial containing residue of the contaminant used in the insulin. The chain of custody was secured, no detail left uncertain. The neighborhood, still asleep during the arrest, woke to a new reality. By mid-morning, news of Karen's detainment spread. Law enforcement vehicles, federal agents, and news vans replaced her usual morning patrol. Residents gathered in hushed clusters, whispering about years of intimidation now exposed. Former allies distanced themselves. Those who had feared her found relief in her downfall. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting and stripped her of all titles, pending legal outcome. Official statements framed the arrest as the result of a detailed investigation into a complex, targeted crime. The fact that the victim was a child elevated public outrage. National media picked up the story. Commentators debated the dangers of unchecked neighborhood authority and the psychological damage caused by power-hungry individuals in positions of influence. Karen Langford, once a name associated with order and control, became a national example of suburban authoritarianism turned criminal. For the family, the arrest was not a celebration, it was a confirmation. Their suspicions were validated. Their evidence, gathered carefully and quietly, had served its purpose. The justice system moved forward, but their son's trauma would take longer to heal. The experience of being targeted, nearly killed, and manipulated into silence left emotional scars that no court could erase. But the truth had been brought into daylight. The threat was neutralized. The father's role in the operation remained classified in its full extent. While federal authorities publicly credited anonymous sources and coordinated investigative work, those within the agency knew the truth. The success of the operation stemmed from the precision of intelligence tactics, the discipline of surveillance, and the strategic patience of someone trained to wait until the exact right moment. Karen had unknowingly initiated a game far beyond her comprehension, and lost it to someone who wrote the rules. Karen Langford's fall marked the end of her reign over Willow Creek, but it also served as a warning. The structures of suburban life, when corrupted by unchecked power, can become instruments of harm. But when justice moves quietly, patiently, and with unrelenting force, Even the most protected perpetrators are left defenseless. The confrontation wasn't loud, violent, or dramatic. It was surgical, it was undeniable, and it was final. The courtroom proceedings moved swiftly, the evidence presented in airtight sequences, each document, video clip, and forensic result, building the foundation for a conviction that was already certain. Karen Langford's defense attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing emotional instability and stress caused by her perceived responsibility over the neighborhood. Psychiatrists examined her and dismantled the claim. There was no psychosis, no breakdown, no delusion. Only a willful descent into obsession and cruelty. Her actions had not been impulsive. They were structured, premeditated, and executed with intent. The prosecution framed the case not only as attempted murder, but also as a cautionary tale about abuse of authority. Karen's power in the homeowners association gave her a platform, but it was her willingness to dehumanize those who defied her control that escalated her from nuisance to national criminal. The courtroom was filled with parents, medical professionals, and former HOA members who had once silently tolerated her overreach. Now they sat as witnesses to her downfall, their silence finally broken. Her conviction carried multiple charges: attempted murder, tampering with medical devices, chemical endangerment of a minor, criminal harassment, and digital fraud. Each carried years in federal prison. The judge called her actions a betrayal of community trust and a display of calculated malice against the most vulnerable among us. The sentence handed down reflected the severity of the crime. 35 years without parole, placement in a high-security correctional facility, and mandatory psychiatric evaluation during incarceration. Her life, once wrapped in neatly trimmed lawns and HOA bulletins, was now defined by concrete walls and scheduled interrogations. Media coverage intensified in the weeks following the trial. National news outlets dissected the case as an example of what happens when civilian oversight collapses under personal obsession. Psychological analysts pointed to Karen as a textbook case of authoritarian narcissism. Advocacy groups for children with chronic illnesses amplified the story to raise awareness about the risks of medication sabotage. The image of a child's insulin vial, once mundane and overlooked, became symbolic of systemic failure and the need for heightened protections. Willow Creek underwent massive reform. The HOA was dissolved and restructured under state-supervised management. Board elections were suspended. Mandatory ethics training was introduced for anyone holding leadership positions. A neighborhood ombudsman was appointed to handle disputes, replacing the unchecked authority Karen once wielded. Property values fluctuated briefly, but stabilized once the reforms were publicly acknowledged. Residents who had felt powerless now spoke openly, forming support networks to prevent future abuses. The family, though no longer in danger, faced a different journey. The son's recovery extended beyond physical healing. Counseling sessions addressed the trauma of being targeted for his condition. Nightmares, anxiety, and mistrust became part of his emotional landscape. School routines were modified. Medical equipment was monitored under tighter protocols. His understanding of safety had been altered permanently by the knowledge that someone had tried to exploit his vulnerability. But with each passing week, progress came. Slowly, resilience replaced fear. The father's career remained intact but deeply transformed. Internal reviews within the agency commended his discretion and effectiveness, noting his restraint in handling a domestic threat without triggering public panic or unauthorized retaliation. His actions were filed under internal commendations, but no press release followed. The agency understood the importance of keeping his role classified. Intelligence work thrives in shadows, and his success had come not from fame, but from clarity, strategy, and timing. In quiet circles, the operation became a case study, used in training modules about domestic subversion, the limits of neighborhood authority, and the methods of unmasking hidden threats within civilian environments. His methods were dissected and admired. His emotional discipline under circumstances involving his own child became a point of reverence, yet he asked for no recognition. He returned to his role, resumed assignments, and kept his family at the center of his focus. Karen Langford's name entered legal databases, psychological journals, and ethics training casebooks. She became a precedent, a warning, and a reminder. Communities must not allow power to concentrate without oversight. Rules must serve people, not control them. And those who hide behind bureaucracy to harm others must be held accountable. Fully, publicly, and permanently. The incident triggered legislation proposals. Bills were introduced in multiple states requiring external oversight for homeowners associations, mandatory transparency and fine assessments, and criminal liability for targeted harassment under the guise of policy enforcement. Advocacy coalitions formed, driven by parents of children with chronic illnesses. Their message was simple: protection must begin where people live. Public memory faded in time, as it always does, but the record remained. A quiet neighborhood had been the setting for a crime born of pettiness and perfected through precision. The perpetrator believed she held all the power. She had the bylaws, the authority, the appearance of legitimacy. What she didn't count on was facing someone who lived in the world of secrets, patterns, and consequences. Someone who understood how justice moves, not loudly, but inevitably. The neighborhood healed. Slowly. Cautiously. The fear lifted, replaced by a culture of accountability. No one would forget what had happened, but they would never allow it to happen again. Want more real stories where justice hits harder than a gavel? Subscribe to Expose Files and witness how HOA Karen got exactly what she deserved. Hit the bell so you never miss a takedown.